Hunter found a white girl hanging from a tree, marked territory for Indians, still breathing when he reached for his knife. The mist hadn't cleared when Arlen Kane, a trapper born of solitude and sharpened by winters, pulled his horse to a halt beneath the ridge where the trees began to narrow. He wasn't searching for anything more than game that morning, just meat and a reason to keep moving forward, but the hush in the air made him glance left, and what he saw stopped his breath. A girl, white dress torn and smeared in earth, her arms roped and pulled high, wrists tied over a branch too thick for mercy. Her feet barely brushed the damp moss below. The tree that held her had been marked like a curse, red letters streaked across the bark, territory for Indians. Not carved, but painted fast and loud, the kind of warning not meant to be seen twice. She didn't move. Her chin hung low, chest trembling once every few seconds, like a dying lantern fighting the wind. She was still breathing. He slid off his saddle without a word, boots quiet in the wet needles, one hand already wrapped around the worn bone handle of his knife. The girl wasn't old, 16, 17 at best. Her face pale with cold and bruised at the cheek, hair falling loose like she'd been dragged for hours. Her dress, once proper, was shredded down the side, buttons torn, neckline ripped, shoes gone. He looked around. No campfire, no horses, no men. Just the forest breathing low and her near-silent gasps. He didn't ask what happened. Not yet. Questions came after the cutting. He stepped close, tested the knot, then glanced again at the trees. Too quiet. Something wasn't done here. Something had been interrupted. And that meant they might come back. His blade found the rope, but he didn't slice right away. His hand hovered. She stirred, just a twitch, a sound from her throat like gravel swallowed wrong. Her lips moved, but no words formed. Her eyes opened slow, then wide. And in that moment, Arlen saw it, not fear, but recognition. As if she saw something in him she wasn't expecting, something she hadn't seen in any man before. He felt it too, but there wasn't time for meaning. The blood on the bark behind her wasn't dry yet. The rope gave way with a sharp crack as the blade sliced through, and she fell like a sack of sorrow into his arms, her weight lighter than he expected, like she'd already let go of most of herself days ago. He caught her gently, adjusting the grip with one arm behind her shoulders, one beneath her knees. Boots braced against the mossy roots as if he'd done this before. Though God knew he hadn't, her breath was shallow but there, rattling faintly as her head fell against his collarbone. Her skin was too cold for mourning, and her fingers still clutched at air like she'd been reaching for someone long gone. The tree above them still held its curse. Territory for Indians. The paint so fresh it bled with the dew, dripping slowly down the bark like tears that refused to dry. He could feel the bark watching him, feel something unspoken left behind in the knots of the branch that held her. She was not meant to be found, not meant to survive, and yet here she was, wrapped in the arms of a stranger who hadn't asked her name. Not yet, hadn't dared to. He stood, her body limp against his chest, and turned slowly toward the woods. And that's when he heard it, the crack of a branch not 20 steps away. Soft, too soft for accident. Like a weight had shifted where no weight should be. He froze, breath hitching in his chest, spine rigid, eyes cutting through the fog between trunks. Nothing moved. Not a leaf stirred. But the air changed, thickened, like someone had held their breath in the trees and hadn't let it out yet. His fingers flexed against the hilt of his knife again, though it was no use now. One arm was full of girl, the other was full of questions. He could run, but the silence said don't. He could hide, but the ground said no. So he stood still, just like a hunted thing, heart echoing loud in his ears, listening for a second step. But it never came. Only the breath of the forest remained. and the heat of her breath on his neck like a ghost trying to wake. Arlen Kane didn't move for a long moment. After she collapsed into his arms, the weight of her body a strange contradiction, both fragile and stubbornly alive. He could feel the outline of her ribs through the shredded fabric. The way her chest rose in uneven bursts, the way her fingers still clenched, even in unconsciousness. The bark behind him bled fresh red like a warning that hadn't finished screaming. Then came the sound again, not wind, not an animal, deliberate. The crack of a branch, light but wrong, as if something had paused mid-step. His eyes darted between trees. Nothing moved. The fog pressed in from all sides like a hand closing around his shoulders. With one slow breath, he shifted her weight higher in his arms, stood with knees half bent, and turned in silence toward the thicker part of the woods. He didn't speak. He didn't curse. He didn't pray. He just moved. The horse followed behind, reins loose, steps careful. Arlen knew this part of the forest like he knew the lines in his palm, but this morning it felt different, like someone had taken the map in his head and torn the edges off. The branches above dripped dew in soft, uneven rhythms, but each drop sounded louder than it should. He walked low, back bent, shoulders drawn around the girl like a shield. Her breath stayed steady, but weak, the way a candle might flicker when someone walks past. He passed a fallen log, stepped over twisted roots, then ducked beneath a pine that split low to the ground, a place only he knew, where the shadows swallowed everything. That's where he stopped. He knelt again, resting her on a bed of dry needles, her head cushioned against his folded coat. The fog was thinner here, but the silence remained. He placed one hand on his knife, the other on the earth, listening not with ears but with gut. He knew the signs, when a deer sensed something before it ran, when coyotes went mute before dusk. That was the quiet now, a stillness built by fear. And in that stillness, he felt the memory of her eyes, how they'd opened and stared straight through him like they'd been waiting for something. Not salvation, but presence. Not rescue, but recognition. He hadn't asked her name. He hadn't even spoken. But she saw him, and somehow he knew she would remember this moment, even if she forgot everything else. His fingers brushed the edge of her sleeve, checking for blood, for breaks. He found bruises, some fresh, some not. Her left ankle was swollen, bare and scraped. She had no voice yet, only breath, but in that breath was defiance. Something inside her hadn't quit. That alone made him press one hand flat against the earth beside her and whisper, almost to the roots, "You weren't meant to die today. And I wasn't meant to find you, but here we are." He reached back for his saddlebag, eyes still watching the tree line. The forest hadn't exhaled. Whatever had broken that branch, it hadn't gone far. He hadn't stopped walking for nearly a mile before his legs finally gave in and he ducked into the quietest pocket of the woods. He could find where the trees grew in such a way that the light filtered down like broken pieces of gold, and the air smelled more of pine and damp earth than of threat. Arlen Kane knelt down slowly, laying the girl on a bed of old needles and moss, wrapping her with the rough gray blanket he always kept rolled beneath his saddle. Her breath was shallower now, but it came in and out, soft and stubborn. Her eyelids barely fluttered, and her lips had turned dry and cracked, yet her fingers were beginning to move, just slightly, just enough to tell him she wasn't ready to give up. He pulled a flask from his belt, unscrewed the top, and set it beside her. Then came the fire. He hadn't meant to light one so soon, but the cold under the trees was creeping up her spine, and he knew that warmth, even smoke, was less of a risk than letting her slip away in silence. The flints sparked, the bark caught, and soon the fire was a low whisper in the clearing, crackling in rhythm with the breath she struggled to keep. Arlen sat beside her with knees bent and hands dirty, watching the flame dance. He didn't pray, he didn't speak, but he stayed. That, he figured, might be enough for now. Then something shifted, not in the forest, but in her. The smallest sound, thinner than air, came from her throat. Not a word, not a cry. Just a pulse of voice, like someone who'd forgotten how to speak and was just now remembering the shape of sound. He leaned in, not touching her, just watching her mouth move. Her lips didn't form a name, they didn't form anything. But her brow twitched and her throat tensed, and for a second her chest rose sharper than before. Then, stillness again. She wasn't fully here, not yet, but something had broken through. Something inside her had stirred, and it wasn't fear, and it wasn't pain. It was resistance. Arlen lifted her head gently and let a drop of water slide between her lips. She coughed, barely, but it was enough. The sound of it made the birds hush, made the breeze hold its breath. He wiped the water from her chin with the back of his hand, almost without thinking. There were scars there, old ones, not from the rope, and bruises new. A man had hurt her, more than one. And yet she'd lived, through the tying, through the hanging, through the silence of the woods and the stare of strangers. She'd lived. And now, in this clearing where no one else could hear, she was beginning to return. He leaned back against a tree and let the fire warm his boots. His eyes never left her. He didn't know what would come next. He only knew that something had already changed, something deep, something dangerous. He could feel it pressing in, not from the forest, but from the girl herself, the way she stayed alive, the way she refused to die. That kind of thing didn't happen by chance. She hadn't said a word since he cut her down. Not a sound except the shallow rhythm of her breath. Ragged like wind through a torn curtain, and though he spoke gently, though he laid no hand on her again, her eyes stayed wide and darting, watching every movement like a fawn that's been hunted once before. Arlen crouched near the fire he'd just lit, back turned to her on purpose, slow and unthreatening, letting her see the water, the satchel, the distance he kept between them. He placed the tin cup by the fire's edge and left it steaming there, untouched, but she never looked at the cup, only at the shadows. Then something changed. A dry branch cracked in the woods, maybe the wind, maybe more. She flinched violently, and then she moved. It was not graceful, not quick. Her legs were still weak, her ribs stiff with bruises, her body barely alive. But she ran. Through grass and brush, stumbling, gasping, dragging herself upright only to fall again. Her dress caught on branches, tore at the seams, her hair whipped across her face. The forest welcomed her with silence, but it held no safety, only thorn and dust. Arlen stood frozen for a moment, the image of her limping figure etched in the golden light like a ghost fleeing its grave. He did not chase her immediately. Maybe part of him feared she'd see pursuit as proof of danger. Maybe part of him understood that trust, once broken, grows like a brittle bone, slowly and only with care. But then he saw her collapse. It was no cry, no scream. Just the sound of knees hitting dirt, of breath knocked from lungs. She didn't move again. Arlen dropped the cup, grabbed his canteen, and crossed the distance with long strides that disturbed the dust at his boots. When he knelt beside her, her eyes were open, wide with fear, but glossy, unfocused. Her body trembled like a branch in wind. She tried to crawl, but the strength was gone. Still, she did not beg, did not ask, did not plead. She merely whispered a word he didn't catch, something half-choked by the wind. And Arlen Kane, who had tracked elk through blizzards and faced men twice his size in border saloons, knelt there and said nothing, his hand still, the fire behind him flickering like a memory he couldn't change. Then her lips moved again. The second time was clearer. She said it soft, but it came through clean. Abigail. He didn't speak, didn't repeat it, didn't ask for more. Just nodded, almost to himself, and opened the canteen. She watched him now, not just out of fear, but something quieter, something searching. He offered her the metal cup, but didn't move closer. She reached slowly, clumsily, drank without looking away. And for the first time, her breathing began to steady. She hadn't spoken since that moment, not when he cut the rope, Not when he carried her limp body past miles of brittle forest and stunted brush. Not even when she collapsed in the dirt like a dying star, scattering her light into nothing. But now, with the fire flickering low and his back turned once more to give her space, the silence broke, not loud, not sharp, but enough to shift the air around them. Her voice was sandpaper soaked in river water, cracked and slow, almost afraid to exist. "Abigail," she whispered. Just one word, and yet it stopped him mid-movement. Arlen didn't turn right away. He let the name hover in the dusk like smoke from the fire, absorbing its weight. Tasting the syllables, Abigail, a name was a fragile thing, a seed of self in scorched ground. And she had just planted hers in his care. He reached for the canteen, lifted it with steady hands, then turned, not quickly, not looming, but with the patience of someone who knew fear by name. Her eyes followed him now, still wary, but no longer wild, still broken, but no longer running. She sat curled by the fire, dress soaked and torn at the hem, strands of her hair clinging to her cheeks like spider threads. Her arms wrapped around her middle, trembling slightly, not from cold, but from what the cold had taught her. Arlen knelt again, offering her water, his hands never crossing the invisible thread between them. She didn't take the canteen, but she didn't recoil either, just looked at it, then at him, as if trying to read in his face the answer to a question she didn't know how to ask. The sun had nearly dipped behind the trees, and long shadows crept like hands across the clearing. His horse snorted softly behind them, stamping the dust. A breeze stirred the branches above, and for a moment all sounds seemed to fold into one long trembling pause. Abigail lowered her eyes. Her fingers flexed slowly, hesitant, then reached out and brushed the canteen. She didn't drink, not yet, but she held it, and that was enough. Arlen said nothing. He just watched, as if the simple act of her reaching might collapse under too much noise. And maybe it would have. Because in moments like these, healing was not loud, not grand. It was a flicker in the ash, a name spoken in the dark, a heartbeat that did not break. The fire was out. Her dress, still wet from yesterday's storm, clung to her skin like a reminder she hadn't shaken off. Her arms scraped from branches, her breath uneven, shallow. Abigail blinked into the silence and realized she was alone. The log she'd leaned against for warmth was cold now. Arlen's satchel was gone. So was his horse. The edge of the clearing looked darker than it had at dusk. She stood too fast, almost slipping on damp pine needles. Then came the sound that stopped everything. Not a branch snapping, not the wind shifting, but a voice. 2, maybe 3, male. Close enough to make the birds go silent, but not close enough to see their faces. Her blood turned still. She dropped low behind the fallen trunk, fingers digging into the moss. She had no shoes, no strength, no plan. But she knew one thing. Those men were not the man who saved her. Their boots hit the ground too heavy, their tones too cruel, too certain. She'd heard those voices before, in the pit where names became currency and women had no faces. Her body pressed tighter against the bark. The breath in her chest shrank to a thread. She couldn't have gone far, one said. Laughter followed. Not kind. Her eyes burned from holding them open too long. Her throat throbbed. She looked around. No sign of Arlen. Her pulse screamed, but her feet wouldn't move. She didn't know where to run, what path wouldn't lead her back into their hands. Then a rustle, not from the men, from behind her. A shadow. A hand. She almost screamed before the scent hit her. Wood smoke and leather. Arlen. He dropped beside her in silence, his rifle already drawn, his eyes cutting through the trees. "Don't move," he whispered. "They're tracking." She nodded. Her lip bled where she'd bitten it. He didn't ask where she'd gone. He didn't say why he left. None of it mattered. Right now, there were men who sold people like stolen horses walking through their silence like ghosts. Arlen leaned close, his hand over hers. "We wait," he said. "Then we run north. You trust me?" Her hand twitched in his. She didn't nod. But she didn't let go. And that, somehow, was enough. The wind shifted, just slightly. Just enough to carry the heat of the fire away from where she lay in the dust. And when Abigail opened her eyes again, they were glazed and slow but filled with breath. She was alive and aware, and somewhere between waking and sleep, the world stuttering in and out like a flickering lantern in fog. The fire crackled behind her. But he was gone. Arlen, the man who'd cut her down, who'd lit the fire, who'd set the tin cup down and waited. Quiet as a prayer, she turned her head, wincing, her hands digging into the dry earth. And there was no sign of him, no satchel, no saddle, no shadow of him by the flames. Just trees and quiet and the far-off song of a hawk. She sat up slowly. Her limbs barely obeyed her. Her white dress was stained brown from dirt and dried blood, torn at the shoulder, and her chest still rose and shallow, hurting gulps. She tried to stand but collapsed again to her knees, one palm pressed to the ground for balance, her other arm hanging limp. She looked around with that same deer-glass fear, searching the edges of the forest for movement. Nothing. But that didn't mean safety. Then hoofbeats, slow, distant at first, then louder. The ground didn't shake, but the sound cut through the trees like a blade. Dull but deliberate. 3 silhouettes emerged between the trunks, horses stepping slow and steady, the men upon them rigid and silent, dust trailing behind their heels, hats down low, faces shadowed, rifles visible. She did not scream. She didn't move at first. She watched. Her heart thudded once, twice. The third beat turned her legs to liquid. She turned to crawl, to slide backward from the clearing, but her body was too weak. Her fingers dug into pine needles. Her foot caught on the hem of her torn dress. She fell again. The men did not speak. They halted their horses just beyond the glow of the fire, in the hush between trees and flames, and for a moment, the only sound was the creaking of saddle leather and the deep, huffing breaths of their horses. And then one of them dismounted. He moved slowly, like someone who had done this before. Boots on dirt. 1 step, then 2. He did not go toward the fire. He went toward her. She whimpered, barely, and pushed herself back with what strength she had, kicking at the earth, chest heaving, vision swimming. Her hair stuck to her face in sweat and dust, and the moonlight lit her just enough for him to see the fear in her eyes. Then, a crack, a branch behind her. Another step, but not from him. From behind. A 4th figure, no horse. Just legs, boots, the glint of a blade. The man who'd vanished, he hadn't gone far. Arlen Kane stepped into the firelight like a storm breaking a still plain. Not fast, not loud, but with weight and intent that changed the air. His shoulders squared, his coat dusted in pine. One hand held the large hunting knife he'd used earlier. The other was empty, loose, patient. His eyes flicked from Abigail to the dismounted man and held. "You lost?" he asked. The man didn't answer. Behind him, the other 2 men adjusted in their saddles. The standoff pulsed in silence, the fire crackling low. Abigail whimpered again, her voice caught in her throat. Then the man took 1 step closer toward her. Arlen raised the knife, Not threatening, not wild, just enough for the moon to catch its blade. "She's not yours," he said. No one moved. Then, without a word, the man turned and spat in the dust. "You'll regret this," he muttered. But he did not reach for his weapon. He returned to his horse, slow, as if measuring Arlen's breath. The three turned together, almost in unison, and rode into the trees again, their silence heavier than words, their shadows longer than the fire could throw. When they were gone, Abigail collapsed. Not from fear this time. From the end of something. Arlen knelt again, slower this time. He did not touch her. He placed the knife down beside him, far from her reach. Then, from the dirt, her lips moved. "Abigail," she whispered. He looked at her. "What?" he asked, gently. "That's my name," she breathed. And then she closed her eyes. But not in fear. Only in sleep. She had whispered her name before collapsing. A single word cast into the dust like a coin tossed into a well. Abigail. He'd held it in silence ever since, like a match he dared not strike, too fragile, too precious. But now, with the fire low and night bleeding thick between the trees, that name came alive behind his ribs like a war drum. Abigail. She was awake again. Barely, crouched low in the dirt where he'd left her by the fire, knees drawn, dress torn, hair damp with sweat and ash. Her eyes no longer darted but locked, focused forward, on the three figures that had emerged from the tree line. They came slow, mounted, horses snorting in the heat of their breath, eyes glinting amber from the fading coals. No words, no greetings, just presence. The middle one was taller than the rest, broad-shouldered beneath a duster that hung like burnt canvas. He dismounted with the casual certainty of a man who believed the world already belonged to him. Abigail did not scream. She simply froze, hands to the earth, heart pounding loud enough she feared they might hear it. The man walked forward, bootsteps soft on the pine needles, not drawing a weapon, not rushing. That was what made it worse. He knew she couldn't run, couldn't fight, couldn't even stand without shaking. The distance between them narrowed with every breath until she saw his face, not old, not kind, but smoothed by years of cruelty and silence. She didn't know his name, but he smelled like the place she'd been caged in, blood, sweat, burlap, and bad whiskey. And then the air shifted. Behind him, behind the horses, behind the two others who had yet to move, a figure peeled from the dark like smoke curling from wet timber. Arlen Kane stepped through the black pine, blade in hand, face like carved granite under moonlight. His eyes did not blink, his mouth did not move. But his presence cracked the moment open like lightning across dry sky. The horses twitched, one reared slightly, hooves breaking silence, but the man walking toward Abigail did not turn. Not yet. She saw it all without sound. The faint orange glow of the fire behind her cast them all in fractured shadows. Arlen's steps were slow, controlled, the knife lowered but firm. A hunter's pace. And just as the man before her lifted his boot for the final step, just as his fingers twitched as if to reach for her, Arlen moved. There was no scream, no threat. Just the briefest flash of silver and the heavy sound of a body shifting in surprise. The man stumbled, turned half around, one hand to his side. The others kicked their horses forward too late. Abigail flinched as hooves clattered and dust kicked up around her. The forest exploded with motion. Arlen met the second rider before his boots touched earth, yanking him from the saddle with one arm, blade finding space beneath ribs. The horse bolted. The third rider turned to flee, spurred hard, but a branch caught him low as he ducked, and the scream that followed was not one of pain but fear, that kind of fear men don't speak of, the kind that starts in the spine. When it ended, there was silence again, the kind of silence that feels earned, that bleeds from aftermath. Abigail hadn't moved. Not until Arlen knelt in front of her, hands empty now, face shadowed by fire and dust. He didn't speak. He didn't reach. But she looked at him, really looked, and she didn't look away. Not this time. And slowly, with arms like reeds and breath like smoke, she whispered again, not just her name but something more. I knew one day someone would come. And he said nothing, but he stayed. The night had a strange stillness, the kind that wrapped itself around your ribs and made every breath feel heavier, as though the world was holding its own air, waiting for something to happen. The soft hiss of the pines outside Arlen's cabin was the only sound except for the muted crackle of a dying fire. The girl sat by the hearth, wrapped in one of his thick wool blankets, her bare feet tucked beneath her, the pale skin of her ankles marked with the fading bruises of the rope that had once bound her to that cursed tree. She did not look at him at first, instead letting her eyes linger on the flames, as if they might tell her something about what came next. Arlen stood near the door, the old rifle leaning against the wall within reach, his hand resting on the wood not from fear, but from habit, a lifetime of knowing that the last danger always came when you thought you'd seen the worst of it. Outside, the moon spilled silver across the frost-hardened clearing. Every shadow stretched long and thin as if the forest itself was listening, and then came the sound, faint at first, a single hoof striking frozen earth, then another, then many, a rhythm no hunter could mistake. Riders. The girl's head lifted sharply, her eyes finding his. No words passed between them, but the message was there in the tremor of her hands beneath the blanket. He stepped forward, crouched before her, his voice low and steady. Stay here. Keep to the back wall, no matter what you hear. She nodded, but her breath caught in her throat as he reached for the rifle and slipped out into the night, the cold biting at his face like tiny shards of glass. The clearing was darker now, shadows moving against the tree line, men on horseback, 3 at least, maybe more beyond the reach of the moonlight. One of them called out his name, not as a friend, but as someone who had been told to kill. Arlen didn't answer. He moved along the edge of the cabin, every step silent in the frost, until he had the wind at his back and their voices in front. His heart thudded with the calm precision that came only when there was no room left for hesitation. The first man broke from the others, riding forward, and in that single moment, the forest erupted with the crack of a rifle. The man slumped in the saddle before sliding into the snow. The horses screamed and scattered. Another rider fired wildly into the dark, but Arlen was already moving, low, fast, his breath clouding in the moonlight. The fight was not long, but it was brutal. When the last echo of gunfire faded, only the wind moved through the clearing. The bodies of those who had come for her lay motionless, their tracks already beginning to blur under a thin sweep of snow. He stood there for a moment, breathing hard, until the sound of the cabin door opening pulled him back. She was standing there barefoot in the frost, the blanket trailing behind her, her eyes wide, not in fear, but in something closer to relief, closer to knowing that this was the end of running. He crossed to her, and for the first time since he'd cut her from that tree, he let the rifle fall from his hands and drew her into his arms. The forest still whispered around them, but it no longer felt like a threat, only the quiet that comes after a storm. The kind that tells you you've made it through, even if you don't yet know what will follow. And maybe that is how the West keeps its hold on those who survive it. Not through its cruelty, though it has plenty, but through the rare and quiet moments when you stand in the cold, holding on to something you almost lost forever, and feel the weight of the world lift just enough to breathe again. For him it was never about the hunt, not really. It was about finding something worth protecting and knowing you'd do it all over again if you had to. For her, it was not about the escape, but about seeing the sky without a rope around her wrists, about standing on her own feet even if they were trembling. And for both of them, it was the understanding that the wild could take everything from you, but it could also give you the one thing you didn't know you were looking for. Sometimes love doesn't come with a sunrise or a promise. Sometimes it comes in the quiet after the gunfire, when the night is still and the only sound is your own heartbeat telling you you're alive. If this story brings to you something, subscribe and hit the bell to never miss tale from the heart of the Wild West.